Everybody. My name is Aidan Cooper, the ENZ Auckland Branch Chair. I'd like to welcome you to the Engineering New Zealand Auckland Branch panel discussion, What is the Future of New Zealand's Energy? Your Auckland Branch Committee is a committed team that is working behind the scenes to develop and host events for our membership. We are always looking for ideas and the opportunity to engage with our membership through hosting events and technical and special interest group events, and with the Auckland tertiary institutions and various other professional and industry partners. This panel discussion is an example of how we have worked with a much wider team, including industry, members, and technical interest groups to bring together leaders of industry to discuss how New Zealand will meet our power demands while meeting our carbon neutrality targets and the engineering challenges that are presented. I would like to make special thanks to Jackson Chu, who has worked tirelessly in the background to make this event happen. Although we are currently experiencing a disruption to our normal operations in the Auckland region through shutdown and lockdown, we continue to engage with our membership through these online seminars and our 2021 photograph competition, an opportunity for our members to engage with their families and educate our children and our family members and share with them our engineering world. We continue to develop our calendar for the rest of the Engineering New Zealand year as well. Moving forward, and to minimise future disruption, we plan to not only host future events in person, providing networking and social interaction opportunities for our members, but to also simulcast online, providing the same opportunity for our members that can't attend events in person. Without further delay, I would like to hand over the evening to the MC of the event, Andrew Bird, from the Hydropower Group. Thank you for dialing in. Please stay connected, and I look forward to meeting you at the next in-person event. Andrew.
Oh, hello everybody, or in Maori language Greek, tēnā katoa. So welcome along to everybody for this discussion around the Energy 2050, which I'm sure is close to everybody's heart and has a big impact on engineering for us as engineers going forward in the next 20 to 30 years. So a bit of a run through the agenda for this evening. Yeah, as I'm sure you all appreciate, we've got a fantastic panel here that Aidan's whipped together, so a bit of introductions around each of those, which I'll give.
Sorry everybody,
but a few salient bullet points.
Andrew's been challenged to come off mute. Just please bear with us. I'm sure we'll be able to hear him soon.
Hello, can you hear me?
We do. Hi, it's Leanne here. We do have everybody coming through, but when anybody's not speaking, if they could go on mute, that would be great.
So can you hear me?
Yes, okay. I can hear you.
Okay, everybody. So yeah, we've got a fantastic panel here today. So we're going to do a bit of an introduction to each of those. A few salient bullets around the Energy 2050 debate, which are salient to the discussion today. Each one of the presenters are going to give about a 10-minute on their view on the Energy 2050 debate and what impact it's going to have on industry and their particular sector. We're then going to have around about a 20-minute Q&A session, which you as attendees to this can direct through Pigeonhole, which you can access via the QR code you see on the screen. Look, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, but obviously, you know, we've got over 400 people registered for this event, so we'll try our best to answer as many as we can during that. So yeah, thank you very much. So, as I said previously, we have a great lineup here today, and I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to each of those, and this is the running order in which they are going to give their presentations. So, first of all, we've got Simon Court, ACT MP. Simon is a civil and environmental engineer with 20+ years experience. in roles for the private sector and local government. This includes 10 years leading engineering, planning, tendering and construction teams, primarily in Auckland, Wellington and over in Fiji. Simon has 3 boys at high school, all different physically and intellectually, and his youngest son has Down syndrome, which influences perspective on accessibility. In local government, Simon managed a portfolio of 200 closed landfills, many in the coastal area, with ageing and failing infrastructure. His experience led to a change in direction and eventually to Parliament with ACT, where Simon sits on the Environment Committee and on the Health Committee and Transport Committee when required. Simon worked in the waste industry and landfill construction and operations, hazardous waste remediation, and on infrastructure and transportation projects. His portfolios include energy, resources, environment, climate, infrastructure, transport, government. And then after that, we've got Nigel Clark, Chief Operations Officer for Genesis Energy. Nigel joined Genesis in October 2016 as Executive General Manager, Customer and Service Operations. And in 2019, he took over the new portfolio as Chief Operations Officer. In this role, Nigel is responsible for driving value creation from our electricity generation assets, environmental management, our Coupe joint venture, and leading safety and wellness across Genesis. Nigel brings a deep executive level energy sector experience and has held managing director and chief financial officer roles within Australia's energy sector, and is motivated by the challenge of transformational change to achieve sustainable growth in ongoing disrupted industry. And we've got Mark Ryle, who's a general manager of grid delivery at Transpire. Mark has been with Transpire since 2016, working in a variety of senior roles, including regional service delivery manager for the Upper North Island, before moving into general management. Previously, Mark worked in project management and consulting roles in New Zealand and the UK. Further to his degree from Lincoln University, Mark completed the University of Virginia Darden School of Business Executive Program. Responsibilities include maintaining the operation, performance and enhancement of our grid assets, such as substations and transmission lines, and property management related to Transpire's assets. He's accountable for the delivery of national transmission grid services to New Zealand, providing effective real-time operations management. We've also got Aaron Hochwimmer, who's the Director of Operations of Power Solutions at ANZ Jacobs. Aaron is, as I say, Director of Operations, consulting business across Australia and New Zealand, and he leads a team of 200 people that are focused on providing solutions to the industry with a focus on the energy transition to a lower carbon footprint. Last but not least, we've got Andrew Casely from ECA. Andrew joined ECA in 2017. Previously, he was Managing Director for MWH New Zealand, now Stantec, and my boss, a global engineering and environmental consultancy. And previous to that was CEO of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council for 13 years. Andrew has a commerce degree with an accounting major and as a companion member of the Institute of Professional Engineers. And as I say myself, I'm a hydropower engineer with 19 years experience working from the UK across to New Zealand and then throughout Asia Pacific. And recently I just formed the new hydropower technical interest group through Engineering New Zealand, and yeah, very happy to be here, invited by Aidan and the New Zealand branch to be hosting this discussion. So why are we all here? We're here to discuss Energy 2050 and what impact it has on us as engineers going forward. As I'm sure a number of you are aware, New Zealand has passed the Zero Carbon Act in 2019, making it one of the few countries in the world that's actually put into legislation requirement to commit to its Paris Agreement commitment of a reduction in greenhouse gases. Also as well, I'm sure a number of you read with interest the IPCC report that was out a couple of weeks ago, really highlighting the issues of climate change and how real those are. And even, with low emissions going forward, we're still looking at temperature rises across the globe, which will have a huge impact on engineering and the resilience of infrastructure as we go forward. Obviously, at the minute as well, we have a Labour government that is very committed to renewable energy and has made commitments to be 100% renewable by 2030. So, look, some very ambitious targets there. Yeah, it's important to highlight that we're not talking about 100% renewable electricity here. This is really the overarching energy debate and the kind of strive towards net zero. So, our panel here is going to talk about how we'll get there, some of the issues that we will have in industry going forward, and what does it mean for Engineering New Zealand and you as engineers. So that's my little bit over, and I'm going to pass over to Simon now to drive the presentation through the next couple of slides, and I'll come back for Q&As at the end. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. Someone give me the thumbs up. Great. Look, thank you for having me this evening. I'm still making a transition from civil engineer to member of parliament, but I can tell you once you have the license to speak freely about those matters which are really important to our stakeholders, to our constituents. I'm not reliant on sending an invoice to a client every month. It comes pretty freely. Now, you just have to bear with me because I've got a few feedback issues in my mic. Okay, we'll try that. So, one of the challenges with energy policy, it's a real danger area for any government, for any regulator, because it actually touches every aspect of people's lives. And so while we would all aspire to have a cleaner environment, we also need affordable energy and security of supply. They're the givens. There are multiple diverging goals that we've seen with the current government. We have a world's most livable city. I live in Auckland. It's pretty quiet at the moment, but that's what we're expecting, according to various plans and announcements over the years. We know that there's a plan to electrify transport and industry as far as practical, but sitting in the middle is 100% renewable energy. And before that, 100% renewable electricity. But if we're thinking what is the purpose of electricity and energy, well, the UN, which is often maligned for taking an undue interest in countries' internal affairs, but in this case, you could see they've actually identified a laudable goal: affordable, reliable, sustainable, and by modern, we can assume making use of best available technologies. And yet, when we look at this, the data that's coming out of the IEA and other agencies, we can see that this pathway is very, very challenging, not just for economies in New Zealand, but around the world. So this is how much energy New Zealand is typically using every year, nearly 600 petajoules. A very large amount of it, nearly 50%, is oil, and then we've got electricity used in our homes and businesses. Gas still makes up a large proportion. Coal sitting there at 4.1%. This was a couple of years ago the slide came from, so likely coal's a much larger factor this year. When we look at where energy is used in industry, 34%, transport, lesser in domestic, and still less in agriculture, forestry and fishing. But it's those top two, industry and transport, which will be the focus of decarbonisation for any government or any central government policymakers. And that's where all the risk lies, because to convert New Zealand from its current status to an energy carbon neutral 2050, or bring it forward 2035, or an aspirational, some might term, an almost unattainable goal, 100% renewable electricity 2030, for example, you'd have to say that looking at all of the trends, there is no single key that can unlock this. We've heard just today that the European Union wants to come into negotiations in Glasgow with a demand that other parties to the climate accords are going to have to reduce their carbon emissions or their methane emissions by a third. It's not possible to see how New Zealand could do that, and I wonder if actually that's simply a non-tariff trade barrier, an opening gambit in a negotiation that the EU wishes to have with anyone who wants to sell stuff into the EU. Is it actually a goal of theirs, or is that just something that that they see as a starting point for negotiation? When we look at the actual emissions from our major city, Auckland, you see we've got 30% emissions from cars and light commercial vehicles. There's no sense that with a growing population that the emissions from these vehicles is going to be reduced in any significant way, apart from more efficient fuel use, reducing congestion, and only at the very, very margins, shifting people out of private vehicles and into other forms of electrified public transport. But in order to achieve that, the timeframe signalled by public policymakers being in 5 to 10 to 15 years appear to be quite unrealistic given the enormous transformation that would be required and the availability of alternative vehicles, EVs and others. So if we're thinking about the options to actually decarbonise the economy and the timeframes that we might do that, we're facing some really stark choices. I've been sitting on the Environment Committee as we've been hearing about the government's proposal to reform the Resource Management Act. And it turns out anywhere you want to build generation or any kind of infrastructure at all, it turns out that that's in the natural environment. We already have significant impediments to building and renewing infrastructure at the size and scale of electricity generation, large-scale manufacturing, let alone relatively innocuous bits of infrastructure like roads and highways. There's no sense in the current resource management reform that consenting anything like a hydro scheme, let alone a wind farm in a coastal area, is going to be easier. So we currently don't have a regulatory pathway to achieving a lower carbon future. We only have a regulatory sword of Damocles hanging over the head of business, industry and consumers. And yet if we're thinking about the tools that are currently available to deliver energy security, to reduce carbon emissions, in particular from thermal electricity generation, they're all available to us. Natural gas is still plentiful, although offshore fields are unavailable unless they've already been tapped. We have other resources such as geothermal and landfill gas even, although at the margins. Geothermal is a challenging one because it's a resource that has claims on it from various iwi Māori groups. Everywhere you find geothermal, you also find unique indigenous biodiversity. And so the thought that regulators and elected officials are going to be asked to make a trade-off between a moss, a lichen, a snail, and 100% renewable electricity that benefits people down the track. It's very hard to see how our current regulatory settings are going to allow that. And yet we have, in the absence of an energy strategy, we have a whole lot of different policy settings that successive governments, but in particular the 2017 government, coalition government, Labour, New Zealand First, Greens, and the current government have thrown down as essentially cookie crumbs, which if you put all the crumbs together and apply a bit of glue, they'd say, well, this cookie is now a strategy. And yet it's not actually created as a strategy. It's bits and pieces that they hope to be able to point to and say, look, this will fix things. But when we look at the actual policy barriers, trust and confidence is a big one. If industry that needs energy and the industry bodies that, or the generators of electricity energy can't be confident in the government's policy settings, it's going to be very, very difficult to justify to their boards and to their shareholders making investments at a level to achieve anything like the renewable energy goals. And a couple of examples here. We have a national policy statement for freshwater that bans disturbing wetlands. Now it's laudable to want to preserve the biodiversity in wetlands. The problem is any time that you want to clear a pad, even to build a cell tower, you may well be disturbing vegetation in or near a watercourse. And of course there are many quarry operations that are currently stalled going into the second construction season now, where they can't get consents to do basic earthworks because of a national policy statement on freshwater prohibited getting consents to disturb wetlands. And that prohibition applies to 10 square metres. There's no sense that that type of prohibition will actually lead to biodiversity improvements. And then of course we have West Coast schemes like Waitaha in the South Island, which were declined by the Minister. And that's after passing every other regulatory test. Again, a lack of certainty. When we think about carbon taxes, who do they benefit, or the enormous revenues? Most recently the government earned about $600 million in auctioning carbon credits, NZUs. Where is that money going? We're not seeing it going into carbon mitigation. We're not seeing it going into adaptation. It's all going into the consolidated fund to be used by the Minister of Finance as he sees fit. So again, the policy settings which apply, a tax or a charge to one part of the economy that's judged to be bad, that should therefore flow on to doing things that will have a positive outcome with that tax revenue, they're not linked either. So there's a lack of coherent policy. And that's before we get to the energy challenges that we're faced with in terms of actually getting liquid fuels to New Zealand and planning for energy resilience. We've typically got less than 20 days liquid fuel stored on shore. The IEA indicates that a nation that's well prepared would have 90 days. Our government believes that IOUs from shipping companies are acceptable, that we don't even need tank storage on shore. So look, thinking about the converging realities, New Zealand, 5 million people, a trading nation at the bottom of the bottom of the South Pacific, wanting to be seen to be leading the world in something that actually we don't have the economies of scale, we don't have the technology, we don't have the investment available to lead it, and making declarations in order to be seen as a good participant, as a good global citizen, writing checks for ourselves that no one's going to cash. We've got issues with security of supply, with resilience, and now affordability flowing through. It looks like the long-run cost of wholesale electricity has essentially doubled over the past 24 months, and it doesn't look like it's going to reduce anytime soon. We've abandoned the emissions trading scheme as the lowest cost, least disruptive method of reducing emissions under a hard cap. And in terms of a regulatory test for which bit of carbon mitigating legislation works, there is no business case that backs up some current government policy like banning gas exploration and yet allowing coal to be burned at phenomenal volumes at Huntly. And when we come to RMA reform, there is no presumption that infrastructure is needed. The question still is, well, do you have to prove that you need this piece of infrastructure in order to get consent rather than it being simply assumed? So, look, I think some of the things we need to consider are, do we have an energy strategy? The answer is no. What should be in that strategy? Security of supply, resilience, affordability for consumers and businesses, clearly. Lowest cost, least disruptive way to reduce emissions. And any carbon regulation needs to have a BCR that's better than the emissions trading scheme, because that's still the lowest cost way to mitigate emissions. And in fact, when the NZ units were selling at $53.75 a tonne last week, that exceeds that price of $50 a tonne that the Climate Commissioner said would be sufficient for New Zealand to meet its low emissions or its 2050 obligations. So you could say that there's no other policy needed. The ETS will already do its thing, according to that learned economist, Dr. Rod Kahn. And RMA reform, any reform, needs to presume that infrastructure, not just public infrastructure, not just roads and rail, but private infrastructure, businesses building things to actually reduce emissions and improve New Zealand's efficiency, that consenting planning should simply be codified. We should just do away with any kind of consenting or permitting regime that continues to apply extraordinary tests that add no benefit. And if we're going to achieve anything like a lower carbon future, then we need public-private partnerships.
Just carry on, Simon. It's just been uploaded again because there's been a few issues of getting it through. So just keep talking.
Thanks, Andrew. So just to wrap up, public-private partnerships. If the government wants to solve problems like dry year storage, and they've proposed the Onslow Dam as a way to do that, it should be considered that simply putting out a request for tender and asking electricity generators and those other technology providers to solve it for them would be the least cost, most efficient way to do that. There is no business case for a government to spend billions of dollars to start building hydro dams when we don't even have enough ICU beds to deal with the global pandemic. So I hope I've given you a sense of what the policy barriers are at a central government level, but also what some opportunities are if we're prepared to actually grasp the nettle and make some hard choices. But they do involve confronting some long-held perceptions, essentially things that are almost sacred in New Zealand about where and how we build infrastructure. Should we ask for permission if we want to build something, or should it be presumed that we can build and use our private property as of right? So thank you, Andrew, for now.
All right, thank you, Simon. I think everybody, we're obviously having a bit of an issue with the presentation at the minute, so and a few people are struggling to keep up. So Leanne's just uploading that again, and we'll see how that goes. But what I'll do is I'll get the people who are talking going forward just to indicate maybe with their finger they're changing slides, and if you do have to advance it yourself, they can do that. But hopefully once Leanne uploads this again, this will be a lot better. But I think we just kind of try and keep some things moving. So over next is going to be Nigel from Genesis. So Nigel, if you can just start, because I think this may take a bit of time to upload, I think. So.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Kia ora, everybody. Pleased to be here tonight, representing, I suppose, some perspectives from a generator retailer point of view. And some of the points I make will piggyback on some of the points Simon's just landed. But the thing I wanted to cover, and looks like we've got some slides coming up now, really just touch a little bit on the energy trilemma, the aspect of to be or not to be on 100% renewable electricity, dry year and seasonal storage, role of cleaner fuels, the role of skilled labour and policy harmonisation. And I'll just see if I can go forward and bring up slides. So from a trilemma point of view, I don't know if you can, the slide's not showing yet. Hang on. All right, here we go. So I'm on the slide, New Zealand's energy trilemma. So the thing about the trilemma you'll hear about regularly is this question of emissions versus security versus costs. And it's that question of, can you have it all? Because when you think about from an emissions perspective, it's going to be elements of where do you get your biggest bang for your buck in targeting emissions reductions. If you think about costs, obviously we hear a lot about energy poverty. We hear recent stories of large industrials being squeezed in their capacity to operate because of rising energy prices. And obviously you have the continuation of reporting of sometimes what can be throwaway headline cost of energy generation versus just conveniently forgetting out the whole aspect of firming up the intermittency of some of the new generations. So costs is a key element. And then lastly is security and reliability of supply. And you only have to look at the 9th of August events the other week to see that as a society we have no tolerance for a power grid that is not stable and providing power 24/7. People's lives are so geared around electricity usage, and then several days after the 9th of August, we obviously saw the interconnectors have issues between South and North Island, which then even further reinforces the questions of stability of our system across the two islands. So the energy trilemma is one that needs to be top of mind as we work our way forward to thoughts of 2050. I'll change slides now to renewable electricity. So of total emissions in New Zealand, even though one could be mistaken in seeing the headlines of the front of the papers, always a beautiful photo of the Huntly Power Station and coal, but in essence electricity generation thereabouts is about 5 to 6% of total emissions in New Zealand. And as Simon articulated earlier, really your big challenge is going to be industrial heat and transportation. And obviously you've got competing interests that are come into play. RMA replacement, iwi interest. You've obviously got the ability to reconsent existing renewable resources already is not a laydown misere. You've got freshwater reforms touted. You've got the NIMBY, not in my backyard syndrome alive and well, where some will look at a wind turbine as a thing of beauty and others will think it's an absolute eyesore. And then obviously transmission support. And when you think about transmission support, question is, are we doing enough as a country? You've got other countries have designated areas. You go to the likes of Germany and the US where they're putting millions and hundreds of millions of dollars into transmission upgrades to build these zones that can bring new forms of renewable to the market. So the question is, are we going to get there, and have we got the right signals to bring that investment on in New Zealand? If you jump to the next slide, one of the real challenges we have as a country is this disparity between our dry year and also seasonal demand. It's dry year we hear the government talk about a lot, but it's not just dry year. It's what happens every year in the seasonal, where demand's highest in the winter when inflows are at their lowest. And this issue isn't going to go away. And so the question of intermittency of generation, storage, batteries can play a role. You're seeing some big batteries obviously installed in likes of Australia, but these are only hours. We're not talking about the ability for days or months in this interseasonal or dry year perspective. So this can't be ignored as New Zealand plots its path forward and considerations of whether we can or can't go 100% renewable electricity. If you jump to the next slide on storage, I mean, just to give a perspective on, when you start to compare to a Lake Onslow and storage that you may wish to build as a country, I mean, you're talking in the case of 3,000 gigawatt hours, the likes of 5 Lake Taupos or 140 Tesla Powerwalls on each home, or 10 million LPG bottles, or 80% of Huntly at full capacity. So the question of storage is not a simple one, and it's that question of what is going to be value for money. And you can look at the likes of an Onslow and the location, bottom of the South Island, and you can start to add up quite a few factors where you start to say, well, is that an economically and geographically smart option? Next slide. So in also thinking about some of the challenges that we have as an industry moving forward to 2050 and the years in between. I mean, question of cleaner fuels is certainly alive and well. Your biofuels, your hydrogens, your green hydrogens, the various forms of hydrogen that get touted. But the question is going to be, when will they become commercial? Will you have the supply security that you need if you were shaping up to use those resources on a regular basis? There is obviously that question of the energy efficiency of the energy you need to use in the first place to create the hydrogen that you then turn back into through a vehicle or the like. So there is that energy cycle as to, is it ultimately a more efficient use of energy? And the question, obviously, in the likes of a Huntly power station is, can you repurpose what is existing is dispatchable thermal generation and repurpose it with new fuels, a la biodiesel, green hydrogen, and biomass pellets. We do have technologies at the Huntly and at other stations that potentially can play that, can have that conversion potentially in the future. So the whole advent of cleaner fuels is obviously very important, as is skilled labour. We have an ageing workforce in our industry. Obviously, over time, you've seen a decline in jobs, not a growth in jobs, as technology and other innovation has allowed the industry to be run with less people. So the question is going to be, have we got enough people going forward? Will we have the immigration that we potentially need to fill the gaps with skilled resource? And is our training and tertiary sector fit for purpose in training up the young people of today for tomorrow in some of these new jobs and the newer renewable technologies and the like? Because we will require different skill sets potentially to what we have today. And lastly is the question of policy harmonisation. Classic case is, if you look at the net zero scheme versus the ETS, you can plant a tree, abate a tonne of carbon in New Zealand that will be valid for the ETS, but then will not be valid potentially for net zero accounting. So you've got a double dip concept if you were trying to pacify both. So for a start, you've got to try and get the harmonisation of not double dipping, but counting at once. Obviously, the question of foreign sourced offsets. This question of, do we view the world as one atmosphere, or does your scheme and your carbon abatement limit yourself to your country, and what has to come from within, or will foreign credits be seen as a valid abatement? That's obviously a big question, as is the question of accounting for carbon. Obviously, that harmonisation of anything where you try to get common accounting or common approach across the world is never easy. So that's obviously going to be something that's pretty important in the next year ahead, or in the next few years ahead. And ultimately, but it's got to lead to action and accountability. Obviously, there's been some schemes in the past that have led to credibility issues. So the credibility of schemes that are accountable and drive the right action are critical. So in wrapping up, there is a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunity. And the question is, the energy industry isn't sitting and waiting for direction on a lot of these things. You are seeing action taken in displacement of thermal generation, new technologies of renewable batteries and the like coming in, and energy management services. So I think the industry is bringing a positive perspective in tackling what is going to be a multi-decade issue. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Cool. Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for the invitation tonight to join your panel, and my thanks to Engineering New Zealand for all your great work that you do, for your leadership and that of your members in driving our economy forward. And I'm especially proud of Transpower's collaboration with Engineering New Zealand on the Wonder project, looking to bring on the next generation of engineers. We're only in the pilot phase, but I can tell you some of our engineers are really enjoying getting out into the schools, working with them on that. So in my allotted 10 minutes, I'll try and cover off where the energy sector's emissions come from, so we're clear on where the reductions have to be made, and I'm going to get on to what we're doing at Transpower to promote a secure, reliable and affordable electricity system as the main platform for energy sector decarbonisation to 2050. So first of all, why do we have to act, and why do we have to act urgently? The latest IPCC report makes it pretty clear that the time is to act now. And this graph shows why it's so important for New Zealand to take action. We're in fact falling behind most developed countries and not pulling our weight. Over the past 30 years, the European Union and UK have been able to reduce their gross emissions by about 20 to 40%. The United States have achieved a 20% decline in the last 15 years. As for New Zealand, we're up about 40%, and we've seen no significant decreases obviously in those 20-year period. We're much on a par with our Australian neighbours. So for us, the message is crystal clear. We're not on track to meet our commitments, and we need bold action starting now to try and bend the curve of our emissions. With energy contributing about 40% of New Zealand's gross emissions and around 70% of those things covered in the net zero carbon target, I think it's our responsibility to work together to seize the opportunity that we have in front of us. So on to where our energy emissions come from, and Nigel touched on this. Our focus is on the bottom three lines. Transport accounts for around half of our energy emissions and is up around 90% against our 1990 levels. Process heat is next, accounting for around a quarter of our total energy sector emissions. This has been largely flat over the past 3 decades. Electricity is the only other major sector within our energy economy and accounts for about 10% of our emissions, which is down slightly on our 1990 levels. So with transport and process heat making up 76% of energy emissions, it seems to make sense to look there first for electrification and other opportunities to decarbonise. So because New Zealand's electricity is already highly renewable, a lot of the lower cost opportunities to decarbonise are in the parts of the sector that rely on the liquid fossil fuels, coal, gas, specifically transport and process heat. And the first focus, I think, always should be on energy efficiency, often the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. Transport, this could be as simple as looking at optimising freight routes to reduce kilometres travelled. For process heat or buildings, this could look like improving energy management processes or installing more efficient equipment. Next is electrification. In March, we released our electrification roadmap, the next paper in our Te Mori Heko series. There we lay out the significant opportunities we see in the transport and process heat sectors for electrification and the key barriers to uptake and the levers available to overcome these barriers. In the transport space, as illustrated on the chart in the slide, light transport makes up about 80% of our sector emissions. With electric vehicle technology improving at a rapid pace, costs falling and supply ramping up globally, we see light transport electrification as a massive opportunity over the next 15 years, especially when paired with a push towards a more active and decarbonised public transport fleet. And yes, the grid will be able to cope if we integrate them well into the system. In fact, it stands to be more reliable and resilient with the addition of millions of what could be flexible two-way power sources connected to it, with the potential to absorb variable renewables, reduce the proportionate size of the peaks, and load shift to make more efficient use of existing transmission and distribution assets. Biofuels and hydrogen will obviously have a role to play to electrify segments such as heavy transport and aviation. And similarly in the heat space, 45% of our emissions are currently now for low temperature process heat and space and water heating applications. applications where electrification is already possible now and cost effective through highly efficient electric heat pumps. Biomass probably also has a critical role to play here, particularly for medium temperature steam heat. So onto the electricity system. As we've touched on, this is in a normal year already about 85% renewable, and we expect to see this number climb steadily over the next few years with already committed projects. So we already know our energy economy is set on a course for decarbonisation. This slide summarises that change and its broad implications for the electricity system, and specifically the transmission grid, which is Transpower's domain. We know the policy and technology drivers, and I've just covered how transport and process heat in particular will drive electricity demand growth. So over my concluding slides, I'll cover what the outlook is for new generation that we're seeing, how we're going about developing the grid to enable these new connections, and outline some of the challenges and opportunities around having a much more distributed system with more inverter-based technology. The chart here shows new connection inquiries for Transpower since the 2015-16 financial year. You can see after 4 very flat years, we're starting to look to get some exponential growth in the numbers. Now, obviously, not all these inquiries will turn into actual projects, but the projects that do eventuate will be a step change in connections for Transpower. So last financial year, we saw a record 63 inquiries, almost 3 times the year before, and over 10 times the year before that. In this financial year alone, in July alone, as pictured, we've received 20 new inquiries, a third of what we saw the whole of last year. And since this chart was put together, we've had 60 more inquiries in the last 6 weeks. Many of these inquiries are for new solar farms and a few wind farms as well. This reiterates the new research that has come out of the International Renewable Energy Agency, which shows that new renewable regeneration costs have fallen well below the cost of new fossil fuel generation. And in some instances, it's cheaper to build new generation than just keeping an old fossil fuel plant running. In New Zealand, it appears you can build new large-scale renewables for around $50 to $70 a megawatt hour. Wind and solar are set to cost less than $50 from 2030. This represents a huge opportunity to address electricity affordability. If we look to Australia as an example, their wholesale electricity prices show us that despite very high and increasing gas prices, electricity prices have fallen from $107 to $35 a megawatt hour in the last 4 years, as Australia has invested in 20 gigawatts of new low-cost renewable capacity. This is our opportunity too, but only if we build it. At Transpower, we're starting to see more new committed generation, and we need to, as we have to replace any retiring thermal plant plus meet electrification-driven demand growth. And not only is that demand growth coming in one EV and one low and medium grade process heat project at a time, we've had several inquiries looking at electrification with hydrogen production, data centres and other large electricity users. So I'll now cover what this means for us as both the grid owner and the system operator at Transpower. But before I do, I thought I'd address the 2 elephants in the room, Tiwai's future and the outcome of the government's New Zealand battery project. Both will determine the shape of the pathway to a 100% renewable electricity system. But in the same way, the market is already making its own decisions around the type and location of new generation it wants to build. Decisions around Tiwai and the New Zealand battery project aren't ours to make. Our job is to just make the connections and ensure we can share the energy. We've done a lot of work on the broad outlines of what will be required of the grid over a range of scenarios with Tiwai and Onslow included. As others make their investment decisions, we need to be ready. We've got 2 major focuses of our work to ensure we are. The first concerns the build-out of physical assets, and we've called it Net Zero Grid Pathways, or NZGP for short. NZGP will be delivered over 2 phases, and as I mentioned, we're looking at broad scenario sets, taking into account uncertainty regarding the timing of market entrance and exits. We're trying to take a least regrets approach to identifying the range of upgrade projects needed on the grid. To do this, we need and value industry and customer input from generators and our direct customers. We're currently focusing on phase 1 of NZGP, which is all about strengthening and increasing capacity in the existing core grid to accommodate that new generation connections and meet medium-term load growth. The Clutha Upper Waitaki Lines project is one project already underway to unlock export capacity from the bottom of the South Island. We've received very valuable feedback during our 2 recent consultations around MB's future electricity demand and generation scenarios that's helping us shape our thinking around the Brunswick, Stratford and investment in the Wairaki region. Through August, we've just been out seeking information on possible Upper North Island non-transmission solutions and consulting on the long list of HVDC and Central North Island investments. Phase 2 of this work will start to look further out. However, the system develops through to 2030 and beyond to 2050, our job in operations does not change from needing to try and maintain a secure and reliable power system, maintain safe and efficient grid operations, and operate a competitive and transparent electricity market. In doing so, we're obviously going to have to adapt. We're going to be moving towards a 100% renewable system at some stage, with less synchronous motors and more inverter-based supply. The broader economy will be much more reliant on electricity as a result of electrification and the potential development of new sectors such as green hydrogen and data centres. The system will be much more distributed, with generation closer to load on distribution systems or behind the meters on people's roofs. Likewise, batteries are going to be connected to the grid, local lines and in people's garages. There'll be millions of smart connected devices. It's going to result in a much more complex multi-directional power flows with great potential though for greater efficiency and security. And the system will be much more digitised with very high volumes of data from those millions of smart devices, from EV chargers to appliances such as air conditioning units. Our challenge is to work with regulators, policymakers, generators, distributors and consumers to make the future a reality while maintaining a reliable, secure and efficient electricity system and market. So to sum up, at Transpower we're confident that the economics and technology are all aligning to decarbonise, not just the electricity system, but our wider energy economy. The path ahead may be uncertain, but the destination is clear. I think if we all work together, we can get there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Before we head on to Aaron, I'll just remind everybody it's all good to see good debate in the chat room there. But if you do have a question, just please post it at Pigeonhole. You can also vote for your favourite questions there too. So yeah, we'll try and concentrate on the questions that have the most number of votes. So yeah, sorry, Aaron, carry on.
No problem, Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm really pleased to be here, and first and foremost, to really appreciate the opportunity, and I've enjoyed listening to my fellow panelists as we've been going. Just to be clear, I work for an engineering consulting company, Jacobs, but my presentation is consultant agnostic, so I'm going to be changing tack a little bit and sharing a few insights from the consultant's perspective, how we can participate in the energy transition and some of the challenges that we see in the consulting industry, and some of the solutions that we can look forward. But I'd like to start off with saying that decarbonisation, it's really important to break it down to two elements. And our race to net zero is two complementary pathways in our view. It's a pathway for energy transition, and a number of my panelists have shared some specific projects and some specific strategies, but also a pathway to business transition as well. So I'll go to the next slide, and really helpful to consider a decarbonisation framework that can be applied across different sectors and across different clients. So when we're working with our clients, we help them understand their baseline and targets, their strategy and roadmap, an investment pathway, a delivery route, the appropriate governance to apply in their decarbonisation journey, the business model, delivery and supply chain, and then monitoring and evaluation. So these elements will be different depending on the sector and different depending on the client at hand, but it's helpful to underpin the conversation with a framework. Just go to the next slide. So we recognise that there are a number of delivery components in the energy transition journey and decarbonisation journey. Certainly energy, so thinking about a pathway to a higher proportion of renewable energy, but also energy efficiency, which was touched on prior, demand side management, and operational change management are certainly components of that as well, that sometimes can be overlooked, but I think one of my fellow panelists mentioned that energy efficiency is really should be low-hanging fruit, or an area of focus. Certainly, understanding strategy is key. Targets, the roadmap and milestones. The resources of a particular company looking to decarbonise, the decarbonisation journey, really looking at the supply chain, opportunities to develop a circular economy, then into their existing assets, operations and fleets, thinking about emission reduction technology and options for sensible procurement and implementation. Carbon offsetting is an area that is a focus, and thinking about how pathways for investment and validation in that area. But key is actually around the people. So driving a behaviour change through an organisation, and thinking about the appropriate process tools and governance to support a decarbonisation journey for a company. So, as I mentioned, from the consultant's perspective, we like to ask a number of clients to help, a number of questions of our clients to help develop a common understanding. You know, I won't read through them all, but some starters for 10 around the scope. What are the bases to set your targets, and what are the scope and boundaries you're planning to set? So really trying to understand the size of the problem. In terms of control, what aspects of your baseline are within your direct control? Who else would you need to engage with and involve to achieve your goals? And importantly, what progress have you already made on your own operations to build on? In terms of delivery, how will you resource and finance the change needed? And what experience do you have of accessing the available funding that might be available? For targets, how will you set evidence-based targets and milestones? And do you want to set targets by sector? And will you need offsetting to help you achieve that net zero target? Progress, how will you measure and monitor progress? What are the metrics to demonstrate that progress and success overall? And what data will be needed to be collected, and do you have it? In terms of the smarts or innovation, thinking about the benefits and challenges of digitisation as a complement to net zero, and how will that actually, this innovation, allow you to achieve that transition? And one of the areas that is sometimes overlooked by engineers is social value and equity. So how do you optimise the socio-economic benefits in terms of fuel poverty, regeneration and health, and how will you make sure that your approach is equitable to all of the stakeholders that you need to consider? So what do consultants bring to the transition? Well, actually a wide range of specialist advice and expertise across the energy transition value chain. So clean energy generation, certainly, transmission and distribution, energy storage, in terms of other areas of interest, consumption management and reduction, thinking about the downstream clients that use the energy, and organisational decarbonisation, so touching on the business transition elements. And consultants certainly can provide areas across the full life cycle of all of these areas, from financing, due diligence and investment cycle support, in terms of supporting delivery management, providing strategic advice in the areas of policy and consulting services, advice around regulatory and permitting, engineering design, cybersecurity, right through to auditing and optimization. So the consulting industry is certainly got a key part to play in New Zealand's pathway to net zero, and really keen that we're here to help achieve that vision and that journey. So a lot of consultants will provide a forum for our clients to work through their strategies and their plans. So it's certainly not a commercial for Jacobs. It's certainly an approach that we take, but it's an approach that all consultants, I think, have a role to support clients. So we offer a tool called Net Zero Labs. It's really a facilitated workshop, really, to work through scope and emissions context, work through barriers and enablers and integrators, solutions and pathways, and really help build that understanding and building actions for people to take forward. Other consultants provide similar sorts of tools as well. But I think near and present, one of the areas that I certainly see as a challenge, and it was touched on prior, is the need for intellectual capital. So certainly what we're experiencing, and I know a number of other engineering firms are as well, is restrictions of importing skills into New Zealand. And this goes well beyond energy transition. I would like to acknowledge the good work the Association of Consulting Engineers, ACNZ, are doing in terms of lobbying our immigration ministry for access to essential skills from overseas, and also the work that Engineering New Zealand is feeding into that as well. That will become increasingly important as we look to provide those technical engineering skills to support energy transition into New Zealand. Certainly, we're not the only country on this journey, and one of the things that we see is a need to avoid a brain drain to Australia and beyond. So there's certainly a global demand for these skills and services, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to provide a vibrant and attractive industry here at home to retain and attract talent. We see that there's a need to grow the next generation in engineering in New Zealand, and I think it was touched on prior. Some of the skills that we might need in the future are maybe not what we have right now. So understanding the STEM courses to support the Net Zero 2050 initiative, there's really a good opportunity as part of that to promote diversity in their profession. And importantly, it's not just engineering. There are a range of adjacent skills and services that feed into solutions, and I think it's a great opportunity for a broader cross-section of the consulting industry to be involved. Finally, I think it's very appropriate in Maori Language Week to acknowledge there's an opportunity here to promote and sponsor Maori participation in this conversation and partnership with mana whenua and communities. And a really good example recently is the good work that the Turapaki Trust have been doing in Mokai around Taupo, looking at a co-located hydrogen production plant with their existing geothermal facility there. They've gone into a joint venture with a Japanese company to develop a 1.5 megawatt hydrogen project, and I think that's a really good example of partnership with mana whenua to advance specific projects in this area. So thanks for listening, and I'll pass on to the next presenter.
Thank you, Aaron, and we'll just pass on to Andrew there. And yeah, look, always happy to get feedback from other people, but you know, right time, right place, please. So yeah, Andrew, yeah, over to you, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Kia ora koutou, everybody, and thank you for hanging in there late on a Tuesday evening. Brian, be nice to me. Just nice comments, please. Right, look, I thought a little bit of context around what the Climate Change Commission has come up with would be just useful context for what they are seeing in their 3 budget periods as to where the reductions they're seeing across these certain areas around emissions. And I've just got there on my first slide for you the picture as they see it out to 2035 or 2050 as it is actually. And you'll see there that, you know, and this is just a brief comment about it, but of course it's so relevant to New Zealand around the biogenic emissions and the challenge that we've got as a country to tackle those. And Simon referenced before the EU moves around whether or not they might start playing those as non-trade barriers, and certainly that would be an issue. But coming back to the energy emissions there, There's no doubt that transport is incredibly difficult. It's sort of typified by the fact that we've got about 3.5 million light vehicles in our fleet. We keep them on average for 19 years. We've consequently got one of the oldest fleets in the world, and we've got a massive tail legacy of fossil fuel use for as long as that number of ICE vehicles are in our fleet, and hence why you're seeing those projections of the Climate Change Commission has come up, that there is no rapid decarbonisation going to occur in transport as presently as it's seen. So the one that's going to show the most promise, and as other speakers have referenced, have got a significant number of emissions related to them, is in our process heat area. And you can see what the heavy lifting is there required for it over the next years and in the short term as well. The next graph here just shows what the net emissions profile is projected to be by 2050. And of course, the residual emissions there at about 20 million tonnes are predominantly, but not solely, biogenic. They are the short-lived gases that at the moment the reality is that they are not going to come out of the system easily unless there is major technological advancement in terms of animal ruminant systems, potentially with pasture species and the like. So, that's just the reality of where things are sitting at this point, and I think it's quite a useful thing to remind ourselves of. The next one here just shows you the graphical representation over that period of time about the reductions that are forecast to occur. You can see the important part that forestry will play in terms of being a sequestration for the gross emissions themselves, and how that contributes to our net emissions profile within that next 15-year period itself. But also just how flat many of those curves are, or lines are, around the areas of emissions that the Climate Change Commission is seeing for this 15-year period of their first 3 budget periods. And therefore, at ECA, we strongly believe, as one of the previous speakers said, go where you can make the biggest difference the most quickly, and where you can get the most cost-effective reduction in emissions themselves, and let some of the more difficult ones just play out, particularly with the benefit of the investment that some of our wealthier Northern Hemisphere countries will make in these areas. The next one here is just a graphical representation of the emission areas and the percentage reductions that are required over those 3 budget periods. And the second one there is the non-transport energy related emissions area. And that's predominantly process heat, not entirely. There will also be significant assumptions there, as Nigel referenced, around the ongoing decarbonisation of our existing electricity supply sector. And so again, it just reinforces what I think the profession should be focusing on, which is where the gains can be made most quickly and most economically. And that is in the process heat area at this point. I mean, I hope that changes in some areas as new technologies come along, but at the moment, let's go for what we know and where the gains are to be made. Just very briefly about
Have we lost Andrew there?
Andrew, we seem to have lost you. If possible, can you just turn your webcam off?
Yeah, so we've lost Andrew. So we'll just give it 30 seconds. Hope he joins back in. And if not, we'll go to some question and answers, just to fill up the time. So. Okay, so we do have some questions, as I say, on Pigeonhole. So we've taken the ones that have the most votes. So I suppose I'll open this up to a number of the panelists. So I believe this is from Brian. So shouldn't NZ be considering nuclear power? It's safe, environmentally friendly, reliable, cheaper than wind and solar when all the costs are taken into account. And by the way, it is allowed. So yeah, I suppose it's probably one. Simon, maybe want to take something on that to start with.
Can you hear me?
There's a lot of feedback there. Right, maybe. Oh, Andrew's back. So, Andrew, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
We were just going to go into a question there, but now you're back. Do you just want to finish off your slides?
Sure. So look, I'll just go to the next slide, just given we've lost a little bit of time there. I thought I'd just make a couple of comments on the supply side and the demand side. And obviously supply side is all about renewables, and I suspect that everybody on this this webinar would be familiar with the criticality that wind's going to play, the cost of investment in that space now, and the investment decisions that we're seeing come to market, certainly over the last year to 18 months, and likewise with solar. And I think that people would be fairly stunned at the rate at which solar is coming to play in the New Zealand context, and the grid scale proposed developments that we're starting to see now by people like Lodestone, the increasing investment in commercial and industrial rooftop, which to me makes total sense. And as Nigel is no doubt totally familiar with, is Genesis' recent announcements to look for the 500 megawatts of grid-scale solar to displace their thermal generation. Hydro, sorry Andrew, but I think it's going to be a hard haul on the hydro front. I suspect there'll be continued investment in smaller scale with the retrofitting of existing hydro facilities, but other than that, I think it's going to be hard work. The other one that I wanted to, or just talking about geothermal, obviously we're seeing further investment in geothermal generation with Contact Tauhara and other investments that have occurred in Northland recently. The other thing that we're noticing is the move towards direct use of geothermal heat, not just for electricity generation purposes. The final one I've got there is on the biomass front, and biomass is an area which has changed incredibly quickly in terms of what I would now describe as the fight for fibre. Is that once upon a time you'd use a Pinus radiata for either pulp or structural timber purposes or packaging of one sort, and now we're seeing multiple uses or potential uses for that resource. And so, you know, we talk about security of supply from an electricity perspective and the cost factor. I think exactly the same issues now apply in biomass. And for those of you who may be advising clients around converting their boiler systems to biomass, that whole issue around the energy trilemma that's been referenced already is so applicable to biomass, and don't lose sight of that. On the demand side, it's been a delight to my ears to hear about the references to energy efficiency. They are the first place to go. They are frequently, if not always, the cheapest initiatives that can be picked up and acted upon, and then find out what your residual energy needs are. In transport, as I mentioned, extraordinarily challenging. The light vehicle fleet to me is totally suited to battery electric. I am highly sceptical of hydrogen playing in that space because of the energy efficiency losses that occur through the production and conversion back again. For businesses, we're seeing considerable movement in the marketplace as businesses commit to taking out their fossil fuel systems, particularly as referenced by the competitiveness of higher temperature heat pumps, and that technology will only improve. The move to biomass, and that's quite significant as well. The other one is with the move to electrode boilers and with some of the longer term supply contracts now that our major gentailers are providing into the market is certainly enhancing that. And driving the whole lot of it is consumer expectation. And I believe this will only just get greater, certainly both domestically, but increasingly offshore for our export-focused industries, and the push for market access that will revolve around decarbonisation. So I think there's both pull going on and push going on around the pace at which change will occur. Back to you,
Okay,
Andrew.
thanks for that. So yeah, thank you to everyone on it. We've now got about 15 minutes Q&A. So yeah, we did get started there when we had that unfortunate drop off from Andrew there. So we'll go back to that first question. So shouldn't New Zealand be considering nuclear power? It's safe, environmentally friendly, reliable, and cheaper than wind and solar when all costs are taken into account. So I'm going to hope, so I'll go to Nigel first on the basis that maybe Simon had a bit of feedback there as the representation of the generator. So yeah, the old nuclear debate in New Zealand, what does the panelists feel? So Simon, do you want to have a crack, and we'll mute you if we get feedback?
Buddy.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, like, I'm often asked this, but in reality New Zealand has access to phenomenal renewable resources that are yet untapped. It's true that hydro is a challenge to get up, but run-of-the-river schemes must be in the mix in the future. But what will have to happen is there'll need to be a much more courageous approach at the planning and consenting level. The same applies to wind. All of the easy places to do it are taken. So moving into coastal areas is probably the logical next step. And that challenges a lot of New Zealanders' fundamental, I guess, cultural association with their environment. But if the problem is pitched, would you rather have nuclear or some wind farms so that you can see when you go to the beach? I'm pretty sure that if it came down to a binary choice, New Zealanders would probably pick the wind farms.
Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts on the panel on that? So, hands up.
Look, I would just add, I think it's incredibly difficult getting the public over the line. I mean, you only have to look across the ditch. Australia is well suited. They've got uranium. They've got thousands of kilometres to bury the waste. I mean, they've got all the dynamics you could argue could bring baseload nuclear to play, but yet the debate really is still not off the ground and doesn't appear likely. So, I mean, I just think public sentiment has moved to other forms of energy, and I think it's going to be difficult to ever get the nuclear back on or get it on the table in the first place.
Okay, thanks for that. So we'll move on to the next one. Question from David Hopkins. So agriculture shows about a 48% of emissions. Are there not opportunities here? And would anyone in the panel like to comment on that? So.
Well, I'll make a comment on that. I mean,
sure.
You want to take that one, Andrew? So, and then we'll move on.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Andrew first, and then maybe Simon after.
Clearly, with a big number, there has to be some moves on that. And just by farming practices alone, they estimate that you could reduce your on-farm biogenic emissions by about 10%. So in the context of those methane and nitrous oxide emissions that are generated through that, that alone would make a lot of sense. And then some of the sort of scientific advancements that have been made by feed supplements and the like hold certain promise as well. And I think if New Zealand can crack that, would be an enormous international advantage that we could play in that space.
Simon, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
I've had a look at some of the breeding programs and been to meet some of those organisations that are leading that. The ability to do it without using GM technology to actually reduce emissions from livestock is a 20-year project. So there's no early gains available there. The only real opportunities are to reduce livestock numbers, and that currently doesn't fit with, there's no government appetite for that. You know, they might talk about it as a solution, but it's not viable.
Okay. We've got a question here to Mark from Benjamin. Even though you work for Transpower, do you truly believe that full electrification of New Zealand energy is the actual answer? On the spot there.
I don't believe, and Transfer doesn't believe that we'll electrify everything in our economy and all energy. So as I touched on, other speakers have also mentioned, biomass I think has a role to play. Heavy transport, aviation are sectors that very hard to see battery-based technology be a factor there. So whether hydrogen, biofuels, some other technology comes along and fills that space, we don't know. So I personally and we see a big role for electrification in helping to head towards net zero, but it's certainly not the sole answer and it's not the only answer.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Question to Nigel, and it's from Santiago. What are the plans for Huntly? Can we make it sustainable somehow? RNG instead of NG? Nigel, any thoughts there?
Yeah, look, our well-publicised position is we are displacing effectively the baseload aspect that Huntly plays. So our Future Gen program that we talk about publicly is effectively that program that's displacing the baseload aspect, but we certainly see the backup aspect that Huntly plays as critical to New Zealand, and you've only got to look at this year to see the role it's played. So from the perspective of Huntly, we still see it as a key asset for the New Zealand system in providing that backup. But there's no doubt that our intensity of carbon coming out of that plant will continue to decrease as it has over the last. Obviously, don't look at the whole decade. One can look at this year, and obviously the trends not where we wanted it to be. But if you look at the ongoing trend, the decarbonisation of Huntly will continue. But it is an important backup plant. So that would be where we sit at the moment in looking at Huntly's future going forward. And is there ability to decarbonise? As I said earlier, some of the cleaner fuels have the ability, should they get to a commercial point, to be able to be used in the Huntly facility. So that's something to keep a watching brief on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Question here from Sam. Have we also discussed the future of energy with First Gas Group? As far as I know, the First Gas Group is currently promoting the hydrogen project by 2035 and 2050. Any comments in around that from the panel there?
Oh, look, I'll make an observation about that. If I had $2 billion invested in a network for gas distribution, I'd be looking at every option for my future as well. So I think the reality around that is that, just what's the feedstock going to be for the hydrogen supply if it's to be blended into the gas network. And again, just coming back to that assumption that everybody seems to be making, that if they want to access biomass, they'll be able to. At the end of the day, it'll be the grower and producer of wood fibre or whatever biomass is chosen as to where it goes, because I suspect they'll always want to go to highest and best use, whether that's as an export log into the Huntly power station or as feedstock for some sort of biogas that's fed into the gas network. So look, I think it's sensible to look at it, but I think just given the scale and volumes required, I just wonder how feasible that really is.
Any other comments on that? Well, it's probably mentioned something close to my heart around seasonal storage. So yeah, Nigel, you mentioned seasonal storage as in your presentation. Somebody's saying that RNG is the only truly renewable long-term storage method that doesn't cost the world to store. I would argue that as a hydropower engineer, but we'll see. But is it something that Genesis is looking at to back solve this problem? And I suppose I'll add to that, and just the kind of general panel thoughts around the options looked at for seasonal storage in New Zealand.
When you say Genesis looking at it, I mean, we obviously are participating in some of the discussions going on the dry year or the battery project. We think there is pumped hydro possibly can play a part, but as to whether the location I'm looking at primarily at Onslow is the right location, we think there is some options on the North Island that potentially would be possibly more suitable and warrant some further exploration. But also the question of, do you have a combination of supply options come together versus rather than sort of one big silver bullet. So we sort of, so we certainly encourage that, hopefully trying to bring that diversity of thinking into the studies that they're doing. But in the interim, we see that dispatchable thermal is really the only thing that can play one of the key parts in that supply gap. And also the aspect of pumped hydro you need to look at is what's your purpose of how you're trying to use pumped hydro. Certainly, if you look at the commercialities of the Snowy 2 project, it's not along the foundations of a dry year type logic. It's the mechanics of a daily pumping and playing the price differential. So the question of how we would use pumped hydro is interesting, and is there valid alternatives? Well, there's some of these other fuel sources come into play. Possibly there is other alternatives. So yeah, leave it there for others.
Any other comments on that before we go to our last question? Try and keep it short. We've got 3 minutes left. All right, we'll go to the last question or statement, maybe just feelings to close out. It seems that we are happy reducing emissions, but that is not enough to counteracting climate warming. What is happening in New Zealand, in the world beyond decarbonisation, I suppose? So. Yeah, okay, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think we need to actually go beyond decarbonisation as a conversation. There are two aspects of the Paris climate commitment. There are two things the Climate Commission's been tasked with. One is mitigation, which we're talking about now. The other one is adaptation. And New Zealand is in a very vulnerable place in terms of energy security, for liquid fuels, for electricity, and we're also in a vulnerable place in terms of natural and physical hazards. So if we want to think about a response between now and 2050, there are things that we can do to mitigate, but actually we need to turn our focus to adaptation. Because if we don't, we'll find that some of our towns and cities, some of our ports, some of our infrastructure will come at a very high cost to have to relocate, adapt, modify if we don't start planning for that now. And those are decisions that future governments will have to face, because it doesn't look like the current government will be making any decisions on that between now and 2023.
I'll add to that as somebody that's worked in the islands a lot in the last 10 years. It's quite harrowing to see the impact of rising sea levels and climate change on a number of these communities. I've been involved in a lot of recoveries from floods, specifically in the Pacific. And yeah, really kind of yeah, adaptation and resilience. They're kind of real key things that are going to have to be talked about in the coming kind of decades around protecting of infrastructure and people's houses, etc. As things start to change. So yeah, it's definitely reducing carbon emissions is one thing, but it's certainly not the silver bullet. And yeah, a lot is going to have to be done as we change. So. Okay, well, I think we've got to 7 o'clock. So, look, you know, thank you everybody for coming to this. I hope you found it informative, interesting, educational. You know, I would like to thank Aidan specifically for organising this and the Auckland branch of Engineering New Zealand. I'd also like to thank everybody on the call for attending. And, you know, it's your own personal time and time to prepare this. So yeah, look, thanks for that. And yeah, here's hoping that we can continue the debate as an industry about how we adapt and change as our world around us changes. So Aidan, I don't know if you got anything else to add to that. So.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for hosting this, Andrew, and thank you to our speakers for attending. Special thanks go out to Jacobs, GHD, ECA, Transpower, ACT Party. Absolutely fantastic job. It's great to see discussion, and it's great to see debate being sparked up and presenting these challenges and talking about possible solutions that will drive New Zealand forward. On behalf of the branch, thank you for your time. On behalf of the branch, please keep in touch. Please maintain contact while we're all in lockdown in our homes and within 5 kilometres. The committee is working on our next social events when we're allowed. But until then, please join in with the photograph competition that we've posted up. It's a great opportunity to get out and around your neighbourhood and work with your people in your bubble to identify engineering in everyday situations. So on behalf of the ENZ Auckland branch, thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to everyone that attended, and good night. Thank you.